Hello, everyone. We're just going to begin in about 30 seconds to a minute. We're just waiting for our attendees to trickle in. Thanks so much. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our event today with Amnesty International to discuss our recent joint report entitled No Credible Evidence, which is a critique of Canada's sordid supply of weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My name is Kelsey Gallagher. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm a researcher with Project Ploughshares, where I study conventional arms control and track Canadian weapons abroad. Project Ploughshares is one of Canada's oldest peace research organizations. Established in 1976, Ploughshares explores issues relating to conventional weapons, nuclear proliferation and disarmament, space security, and emerging technologies. We are very pleased to share the stage today with Amnesty International. Amnesty, recently celebrating its 60th anniversary, I should note, is one of the world's foremost organizations defending human rights wherever they are threatened. Our recent joint report is a comprehensive analysis and rebuttal to Canada's provision of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Canada has for decades supplied weapons, in particular light armored vehicles, which we will refer to as LAVs, to the kingdom. In 2014, Canada announced its largest ever arms deal, $14 billion worth of LAVs to Saudi Arabia. The deal came under immediate scrutiny. Saudi Arabia not only deprives its own citizens of basic human rights, but since 2014 has been a main belligerent in the war in Yemen, one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. Saudi Arabia faces credible allegations of breaching international humanitarian law in that conflict, acts which may amount to war crimes. In 2020, Canada released its final report, Review of Arms Exports to Saudi Arabia. In this document, Canadian officials come to the problematic conclusion that there is no credible evidence Canadian weapons supplied to Saudi Arabia could breach human rights, and that such transfers are within the bounds of the Arms Trade Treaty, or the ATT, which is an international framework Canada acceded to just months prior to the publication of the report. Our recent report comprehensively refutes such claims. We come to the conclusion that Canada's supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia contravenes its obligations under the ATT, and therefore such exports must come to an end. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today and get into and actually jump into the discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Verity Coyle. Verity is a senior advisor with Amnesty International based in London, United Kingdom, and is a mainstay in the field of international arms control. Alongside her role with Amnesty, she has worked with such organizations and coalitions as the Stimson Center, Control Arms, and the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. Thanks for joining us, Verity. Justin Mohammed, good to see you, Justin. Justin is Programs Manager with the English section of Amnesty International Canada. Justin has much experience working both in Canada and abroad, advocating for the human rights of vulnerable populations, recently particularly those facing forced migration. Justin joins us from Ottawa, Ontario. Hey, Justin. Last but not least, Cesar Jaramillo. Cesar has long worked to further international arms control and has been Executive Director of Project Ploughshares since 2015. Cesar has contributed to the fields of regulating arms transfers, to nuclear disarmament, to space security. Cesar joins us today from Waterloo, Ontario. Hi, Cesar. So with housekeeping out of the way, we're going to jump right into the main part of our webinar today. And we have a bunch of questions to get to. We're hoping to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So any questions, please pose them in the chat. And this first question, I'm actually going to throw the mic back to you, Cesar, if that's okay. So Ploughshares and Amnesty recently released this major report on Canadian arms exports to Saudi Arabia, entitled, again, No Credible Evidence, Canada's Flawed Analysis of Arms Exports to Saudi Arabia. So before we get into the kind of weeds in the context of the report, can you give us kind of a basic rundown of this deal that has kind of been very controversial since its signing in 2014? What does the deal include? You know, some context. What does that look like?
Absolutely, Kelsey. Thank you very much. And very briefly, thank you very much to all the attendees and to my colleagues and fellow panelists, both of whom are great professionals in this field. So the deal, yeah, let's get the facts straight out of the way before we get to the Canadian government's response to our own assessment, etc. So as Kelsey said, it was announced in February 2014. On Valentine's Day, on February 14th, 2014, and my colleague Ken Epps, I recall he wrote a piece for Project Ploughshares entitled "A Perverse Gift for Valentine's Day." And when it was announced, this deal was framed as with much fanfare. There was no secrecy then about the fact that there was this deal. There was a lot of fanfare around it, and was framed as an economic victory for Canada. And it was not only, Kelsey's right, that it was the largest arms exports deal in Canadian history, but more than that, and in addition to that, it was the largest manufacturing contract in any category for Canada. So it was framed as an economic victory, announced then by Minister Ed Fast under Prime Minister Stephen Harper back then. And the related question to what do we know about the deal will be, and this will come across throughout this event perhaps, what don't we know about the deal? Because a recurring theme from the government's perspective has been that of secrecy. And this deal has been shrouded in a lot of secrecy, despite the fact that modern expectations around the arms trade really place a huge premium on the concept of transparency. And that has been lacking. So I'll focus very briefly on three aspects of the deal. One, the recipient itself. And I will say, when it was announced, not a lot of emphasis was placed on Saudi Arabia and let alone on human rights, but we started digging, collectively, several people. And of course, the recipient is Saudi Arabia. And it is one of the very worst human rights violators in the world. And I always like to emphasize that this assessment is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. And that is backed up by demonstrable data, by documentary evidence that Saudi Arabia, time and again, year after year, is at the very bottom of any authoritative ranking concerning human rights, by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, by Freedom House, etc. Freedom House, I might add, has a special category they call the worst of the worst. And sure enough, every year, Saudi Arabia is among the worst of the worst. So it's really an abysmal human rights record that should, ask the question, why is Canada arming this recipient? Secondly, our concern is not rooted on wishful thinking. This is not a matter of an absence of norms. There are very clear norms in place that should prevent this type of deal from proceeding. I won't get into that because I know we will eventually, including my colleagues. But I want to emphasize that this is not an absence of norms of or a peacenik sort of desire. Let's not arm Saudi Arabia. This is a matter of compliance with the law. As simple as that, compliance or lack thereof of compliance with the law. And as you will see, one of our key conclusions for the report, not to foreshadow too much, is that there is really a matter of non-compliance. And the last aspect that I would highlight is that this is indeed an arms deal. This is not just an export contract where we're shipping, Blackberries or phones or desks. We're shipping arms. And I emphasize this because there have been attempts from two consecutive governments to minimize the extent to which they are considered to be weapons exports and part of the arms trade. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, someone notably referred to them as transport vehicles or trucks. These are just transport vehicles. Current Prime Minister Trudeau said these are nothing but jeeps. But the reality is that we know, and through digging through media reports, etc., and then access to information requests, sort of putting the story together, that these so-called jeeps actually include anti-tank vehicles. They include heavy assault type vehicles armed with cannons affixed to their turrets that have been used. These are heavy assault vehicles that are combat ready. So there is no ambiguity as to whether or not they should be strongly restricted and including under domestic and international law. So I will leave it there, but yeah, those are sort of the basics of the contract.
And that's a great point, Cesar, right? Saudi Arabia is not only the recipient of these LAVs manufactured in London, Ontario by General Dynamics Land Systems Canada. We sell these platforms to other countries, including the US, including Colombia. And when we sell them to our allies, let's say the US, the line used by the government of Canada are, these are the best of the best combat-ready tank-esque vehicles. But when we see them going to those destinations that might receive flack from the media or civil society organizations, they are tanks or they are transport vehicles. So we see kind of the narrative around them change depending on who the recipient is, but the vehicle nonetheless stays the same. So Justin, if I could throw this one to you. So our recent joint report was a direct response to this report that I mentioned that was published by the government of Canada, their final report. What can you tell us about the context in which Global Affairs Canada, or GAC, as we might refer to them as, what was the context in which GAC wrote and published this report? What was going on? You know, the report itself is quite lengthy. I think it's 30 or 40 pages or something like that, quite detailed. You know, why would GAC feel the need to publish something? And maybe some of the context, you know, in particular, things that were going on. We know that Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated just before you know, the generation of this report was announced. So kind of what was the climate in which the government of Canada felt the need to write such a report?
Yeah, that's right. And thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay. I've had to do a last minute headset change. So very good to be with you. Thank you all for joining this conversation, Kelsey for moderating, and my co-panelists for being here. It's very humbling to be on this panel in the presence of folks who have been working on these issues for so long. But thanks for setting us up with that question, Kelsey. I think that our report, No Credible Evidence, is really a response to the final, what they call the final report by Global Affairs Canada. And actually, it's two reports that we need to look at here. So I think you framed it very well to start with the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, and I think it would be useful to understand that as a bit of a starting point. Even though Cesar has mentioned that this is a long-standing arms deal, I can sort of take it from the moment of Jamal Khashoggi's brutal assassination as a starting point for understanding kind of where we are now. So following the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, very shortly after, the government responded to that news with a cessation of new weapons exports. It's very important to understand that Canada has not ever, in this period, canceled all exports. They've just put a hold on issuing new export license permits. And so that's what they did in the wake of this news. Now, it's very interesting in the context of our discussion around the Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT, as we might refer to it, that this was the reaction of Canada, because what the ATT really regulates is the use of conventional arms. And this action, while cruel and reprehensible and tells us something about the human rights perspective of Saudi Arabia, it's not something that would actually be taken really into account in making a determination around arms exports. Nevertheless, that's what the government did in response, and it made that suspension about a month after Jamal Khashoggi's assassination. And at the same time, they announced that they would do a review, that the government would do a review of weapons exports to Saudi Arabia. So it's not until September of 2019, so this is almost a year later, that we have Canada's first report, which was later sort of branded as an interim report. They say they finished their so-called review and they issue a report. And this report is a 6-page report on the findings. And it does use this term that we then used as the title of our report, that there is no credible evidence linking Canadian arms exports to the violations committed by Saudi Arabia, either domestically or in its international activities in the war in Yemen. And that report is dated the 17th of September. So that's the same day, actually, Canada acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty. So Cesar's talked about Valentine's Day. This one is on the very day that Canada is bound at international law by the Arms Trade Treaty. This 6-page report is Canada's report on the implication of Canadian arms exports in the Commission of Serious International Crimes. You sort of can't make this stuff up in terms of the dates lining up. So they do that. We have a 6-page report, and over half of a year later, in April 2020, Global Affairs Canada, or GAC, releases yet another report to justify its ongoing arms exports to Saudi Arabia. And they call this one the final report. And that's the report that we're analyzing in our report, No Credible Evidence. And I think what we've really tried to do there is to trace all of the analysis that the government had done. And if you can imagine, we're talking about basically from October 2018 to a final end date in April 2020 of when they've decided that, okay, you know, we can get, it's all good, Canada continue with its arms exports to Saudi Arabia. So what you see in this report, this joint report of Amnesty International and Project Ploughshares, is really an attempt to look at the government's analysis and demonstrate, I think as Cesar put it very clearly, that there was all kinds of evidence that wasn't taken into account, that the analysis that's required in the Arms Trade Treaty wasn't done in the proper and the correct way, the legal standards to which Canada is bound at international law. And I know that we're going to get into a little bit of that more in detail a little bit further in our conversation. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can pick up some of these themes as we go.
Thank you so much, Justin. And on the topic of international law, which is something that we will, you know, you're going to hear us referring to a lot. We're lucky to have once again Verity here from an international perspective. So Ploughshares and Amnesty Canada, we obviously look from a Canadian perspective, but Verity with the International Secretariat can pull in that international perspective from the ATT. And I mean, the obligations on any state that accedes to the ATT are universal, right? So Verity, at the end of our report, we come to the conclusion that Canada is not in compliance with its legal obligations under the ATT in its arming of Saudi Arabia. A related recommendation is, as such, that Canada must stop these transfers. So in terms of the ATT, can you explain some of the expectations on states parties, right? When a country like Canada or any country voluntarily accedes to the ATT, and once again, this is a voluntary process. When any of these states parties voluntarily accede to such an international framework, what are those expectations? What are the new rules that such member states, if you will, have to follow?
Sure. So just to add my thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be with you. And I think when I first saw this report, I was delighted that you had done such a forensic examination of the situation and put it across so clearly. And, you know, congratulations. The report is really, really excellent. I think I had a kind of prepared answer, but listening to what's been said, I just want to reflect on something that has really struck me over the last few years while I've been attending the ATT meetings. And lots of states joined the ATT very quickly and maybe weren't completely ready or compliant or had all the systems in place that they needed, right? Canada took its time, and Canada was very intentional in how it presented itself to the rest of the ATT community by saying, we are taking our time so that we can be completely ready, have all the systems in place, make sure that our analysis for our risk assessment is correct before we bring ourselves into this space fully. And I think, you know, reading the report, looking at the dates, putting all those things together, it really strikes me that here we are in the situation with this deal, these deals that are going ahead throughout that time frame, and with that no other state acted the way that Canada did, I guess is what I want to say about their joining of the ATT. But I do just want to zoom out for a minute and kind of say, you know, from the start of the conflict, a consortium of states around the world has supplied members of the Saudi Arabia and UAE-led coalition with billions worth of military equipment. And while the main recipient has been Saudi Arabia, Western states have also supplied the UAE with billions worth of warships, combat aircrafts, tanks, armoured vehicles, small arms, light weapons, associated parts and ammunition. Despite overwhelming evidence, as my fellow panelists have said, these arms are being used in war crimes and other serious violations in Yemen. Such states, the USA, UK, France, European countries, continue to supply the coalition members in breach of obligations, including of the Arms Trade Treaty and also their regional and domestic laws. So Amnesty has a kind of absolutist position on this. We urge all states to ensure that no party to the conflict in Yemen is supplied, either directly or indirectly, with weapons, munitions, military equipment or technology that could be used in the conflict until they end such serious violations. And this also applies to logistical and financial support for the transfers. And you asked about what the ATT requires. There are a few kind of key elements of the treaty that are important here. Article 6 is an absolute prohibition of the export of weapons that would violate things like the UN Security Council resolutions, UN Charter obligations, or other international agreements which a member state is a party to. It includes cases where the state has knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, attacks directed at civilians. And these prohibitions are characterized as being absolute because, unlike the risk assessment process in Article 7, there's no possibility to overcome such factors through mitigation measures. And then into the kind of Article 6, where they're not, Article 7, sorry, so where they're not prohibited under Article 6, arms exporting states are required to conduct a risk assessment. And there are different ways that states do this. There is no universal way. In a previous role, I was a researcher with the Stimson Centre in DC. And one of the things we did is we spoke to a lot of exporting licensing officials about their processes. And we were really struck by a few things there. Lots of these export licensing officials were interpreting the ATT in a way that was time sensitive to the overwhelming amount of work sometimes they had. And this is just on a human level, and it's not to kind of make a excuse for any of this, but it does feel like an area that is understaffed in many, many governments. And with that, we all know what that's like, especially during COVID, working from home, kids, like the whole thing's been going on, right? Imagine having all of these licensing requests coming in and having to make these assessments. So there's kind of a part there, but also there is no standard procedure that people follow. And the last thing I think to mention that's relevant to your report is Article 11, and that addresses the issue of diversion. And this is a really big deal. Like, the majority of reasons why arms export licenses get refused is because of the risk of diversion. And that has come across in all the research I've done. And if you look at the amount of time that states parties spend talking about diversion rather than about the human rights risk assessment, you can see where the kind of balance of interest lies at the moment. Cesar and colleagues from the Control Arms Coalition, we spend a lot of time trying to get states to talk about Article 6 and to really talk about their human rights compliant risk assessment. The treaty is quite new, is the last thing I'm going to say. Treaties take time to bed in, and it requires consistent focus from organisations and civil society to make sure that it does live up to its objective of reducing human suffering. I'll leave it there, Kelsey, thanks.
If I may, with the chair's indulgence, just to add something, and I absolutely concur with everything that Verity has said. One aspect of the ATT regime that folks might perhaps be disheartened or discouraged about, and we're very strong supporters of the Arms Trade Treaty, but perhaps folks might be surprised that there are really no enforcement mechanisms, you know, like within the regime itself, and even having clarity around an indictment of non-compliance is, it's an elusive pursuit sometimes, and it can come down to he said, she said, or something like that. And I've been in situations personally that somewhat anecdotally when I've been with in the context of ATT conferences, making the case to the delegates of a given state, saying, in our view, our expert research conclusion is that you are not in compliance with the Arms Trade Treaty, and they will say, in our view, we are in compliance, and that's it. Okay, so we have like a different view, but that's just to emphasize the point that any expectations. Okay, so Canada is caught, in our assessment and as reflected in the report, somewhat red-handed as a matter of non-compliance. What's going to happen in the regime? Are they going to be kicked out, or are there going to be consequences? No, likely not. And just like Canada, other states parties are arming the not just Saudi, but as Verity rightly point out, others, including the UAE. So yeah, I mean, it's a work in progress, and we see great value in the normative value in the ATT, and it's in the big scheme of things. It's a recent regime. It's a gradually being entrenched, and there's a role for civil society always to keep up the scrutiny on states parties and bring them to compliance. But there's no enforcement mechanisms per se.
No, all good points, both Verity and Cesar. And Verity, you actually bring up an interesting phenomenon of the real focus on diversion. States, including Canada, seem to be more susceptible to allegations of diversion than the likelihood that human rights will be breached if a risk assessment, a bona fide risk assessment is undertaken and risk is found. And this is something that we've noticed. Canada recently canceled the export licenses for certain arms to Turkey, which is a good thing, and we campaigned for that. However, their assessment only came to the end of cancellation due to diversion, not due to the fact that these were being used almost certainly to breach IHL in several conflict zones. And even in the media attention afforded to this report, we've noticed that almost many of the questions we get only have to do with diversion, when diversion is one small slice of all of the things that have to be considered. And first and foremost, it's protection of human rights, really. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. It's something I've thought about. I don't know, maybe if diversion is something easier for people to envision or something, but something we certainly have to note down and to overcome, I think. So something that we've already discussed partially is this concept of risk. And Cesar, I'm going to ask your opinion on this. So the determination of risk or substantial risk in Canadian parlance, overriding risk in the ATT, is a concept that is central to the ATT. Now, the government of Canada really talks about evidence, which is actually where the title of our report, No Credible Evidence, comes from, right? In their assessment of potential violations of human rights with Canadian arms exports. So what is this relationship between evidence and substantial risk, right? What is the relationship between them? Does the ATT talk about evidence? What does the Canadian government say? What does the law say? What does that look like?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kelsey. Great question. I mean, first of all, I'll say immediately that the word evidence does not appear once in the ATT. Not once, and it doesn't appear in Canadian law either. But this has, to frame the context, over the past, since the deal was announced, this multi-billion-dollar year deal, there's been a bit of a back and forth between civil society and the government on this question of compliance. And through it all, the government has had various, let's call them, lines of argument. Sometimes we've seen no credible evidence. Sometimes there may be penalties. Sometimes if we don't do it, somebody else will, which is devoid of any ethical considerations. But they haven't even been consistent. So it comes and goes. But one of the strong ones has been this: we have seen no credible evidence. And the way we have responded to them has been first by pointing out, well, actually, that is not the standard. That is not the threshold set by domestic or international law. The threshold, the standard, the key criterion by which to determine the authorization of export permits is and should be, and it's not a matter of opinion or interpretation, risk. And these are not interchangeable concepts, even by basic Oxford Dictionary standards. These are not interchangeable concepts. And when it comes to a risk assessment, beyond the Oxford Dictionary definition, they have different implications. An assessment that is based on credible, conclusive evidence will happen by definition after the civilian has been killed or maimed, whereas an assessment based on risk seeks precisely to avoid such a scenario. We don't want the evidence. We want the assessment to be based on risk to avoid these human rights violations, but it's not just a matter of what we want. It is what the law obligates Canada to do. But they have persistently, and dare I say misleadingly, insisted on this notion of credible evidence. If we see credible evidence, we may act. If we see credible, conclusive evidence, we may act. But the kicker here is that even this higher made-up standard has been met. We have seen risk, clear and present and consistent risk, both within Saudi borders and in neighboring Yemen and in Bahrain and in other places of their proclivity to use arms exports against civilians, including LAVs, including Canadian LAVs. So every level of specificity has been met to establish risk, and furthermore, to establish evidence. Yet the government obstinately keeps pointing to this standard of evidence. To give you two concrete examples. So in 2016, there was a heavy-handed crackdown by the Saudi authorities, by the armed forces against civilians. And it was clear, and the Canadian government never denied that there was heavy-handed use of force against the civilians. But at that point, it wasn't absolutely fully determined that the vehicles in question, the armored vehicles in question, were actually the Canadian ones. But even so, we thought, okay, but the proclivity to use force has been established and to abuse these exports, even if they were not Canadian. But they made a big deal. Are these the Canadian ones? The next year, in 2017, in the eastern province, close to a place called Awamiya, and other heavy-handed security crackdowns in which scores of Shia minority civilians, which are known to be persecuted in Saudi Arabia, were killed, in which reputable news organizations including Reuters, reported on this. There was no doubt whatsoever that Canadian vehicles were involved. And in the subsequent investigation that was launched by the Canadian government, the greatest weight was given to the official Saudi version of events, that everything had been by the book. And based on that Saudi version, which is the most obvious conflict of interest imaginable, the Saudi version of events, based on those Saudi version, that everything was kosher and by the book, Canada reinstated the export permits. So there's been an intentional resistance to recognizing this risk that we see, not only in Saudi Arabia, but beyond its borders, and including Yemen, where the United Nations itself has accused the Saudi-led coalition of systematic targeting of civilians. And there is a term for that, and it's unambiguous, and it's called war crimes. So we're effectively a war criminal that the Human Rights Council, through a group of eminent experts that prepare a report for it, specifically mentioned Canada, among other asset forces, to Saudi Arabia, to being contributors to the crisis in Yemen. So once again, within its borders and beyond its border, the risk is clear, and that should be the basis on which to deny export permits.
Thank you, Cesar. That was a comprehensive answer. And I see, I'll remind attendees to please pose questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I see the chat is live, which we always love to see. I did see one question from Miriam that asked, I'm just going to address now what diversion is. Might be playing a bit of inside baseball here, so let us know if we do need to define things. Diversion is the illicit rerouting of weapon systems from the intended recipient to an illicit third party. So in this case, if Canada sells weapons to Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia turns around and sends them to basically any other actor, that is diversion, and that is that's in contravention of the export permit or export license. So that essentially that risk needs to be mitigated by parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. So Justin, I'm going to throw this one to you. So there's concerns about Canadian arms exports being misused both within and outside of Saudi borders. So obviously within Saudi borders, instances such as the crackdown in Al Awamiya, which Cesar brought up, and then outside, which we can think of as Yemen or other places. So what can you talk about these two dimensions? And in terms of Canada's assessment of risk, I mean, should they both be equal, right? Should Canada look at one or look at the other? Again, what does this relationship look like?
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. And a lot of what's actually been said, I think, sets us up for a good discussion around this. And the short answer is that they're each to be given exactly equal weight. So under the Arms Trade Treaty, there's no distinction about where the weapons are being used, but only the international law violations, namely violations of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, gender-based violence, et cetera, for which they may be used to either commit or to facilitate. And I want to come back to that word facilitate in a second, but Verity set up really a very clear understanding around Article 6 and that absolute prohibitions, the types of acts for which arms exports, if they know that they're going to be used, for example, to be committing a genocide, then they would not, they're absolutely prohibited, meaning that there's no mitigating measures that Canada or any other state's party could undertake to mean that that export is okay. That's the realm of Article 6. And again, Verity has gone through in clear detail about how the risk assessment under Article 7 comes in. And I just opened parenthetically to talk about that because even under Canadian law, this is another area where, despite the assurances of how deliberate the Canadian process was in acceding to the Arms Trade Treaty, there's actually that Article 6 prohibition is not reflected in Canadian law. And that's a really disappointing thing because, organizations like Ploughshares, like Amnesty, like Oxfam, like the Rideau Institute and Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, all testified in the parliamentary proceedings for Bill C-47, which was the law that made Canada compliant with the arms trade, or supposedly made Canada compliant with the Arms Trade Treaty. And there's evidence on the record, there's written reports on the record that these organizations put forward and said, your proposed law is missing the requirements of Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty, and it needs to be addressed somehow in the law. And unfortunately, the law that Parliament, in its wisdom, or in this case, I should suggest in its lack of wisdom, did not incorporate into Canadian law. And so that's a real deficiency in the Canadian legal standard. But coming back to that issue of commission and facilitate, I think this is really important because it's one of the chief elements that's missing from Canada's analysis. And Cesar touched on it when he talked about this issue of evidence. Commit or facilitate these violations of international law. And instead, Canada sort of continues to look for this smoking turret to say, okay, here's the light armored vehicle that fired on civilians and committed a war crime, and now we're going to stop exporting arms. That's not the test. That's the wrong test. It's the wrong approach, as Cesar has outlined. So I thought it might be useful to maybe talk through an example about why that facilitation piece is just so important. And it does actually relate to the example that you drew from the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. So let's say that, for example, Canadian light armored vehicles were used to surround a village. And then armed forces went into that village and they started using, machine guns to indiscriminately fire on civilian population or whoever they thought, maybe there was military mixed in, but they did so indiscriminately. So the light armored vehicles aren't necessarily shelling that village, but they have facilitated the commission of those crimes. And that's the type of analysis that would be captured by the risk analysis that Canada is supposed to do under Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty. And that hypothetical that I set up there would be equally applicable as to whether it happened, for example, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, or if, like it did in 2017, or in the context of, for example, the war in Yemen. So to kind of come back to my short answer of that question, really, it doesn't matter where the weapons are being used. What the Arms Trade Treaty focuses on and what it's meant to prohibit or to mitigate, at least through the Article 6 and Article 7 provisions, is to make sure that these weapons are not being exported to cases in which they risk being used to commit those very serious human rights abuses. Domestically, internationally, the whole purpose of the treaty is to make sure that human beings are not suffering those greatest excesses of conflict, civil strife, and so on. So I'll leave it there.
And that's several excellent points, Justin, right? And just to add to that, I mean, not only is the threshold of evidence, again, not included in the ATT and problematic for several reasons, but if the threshold of evidence was what Canada had to go off of, then that means that we would have to wait for human rights to be violated to stop exporting weapons, right? We want to analyze that prospective risk so that we are not going to arm those actors that are going to violate human rights in the first place, right? And we know that once weapons are shipped abroad, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to do anything about that, right? Once they're out of your hands, they're going to go to bad places, and they might be used by bad actors. So we need to be very careful about the risk assessment process and who we're going to actually arm through the lens of a prospective risk. So it should be noted that unfortunately, it is not just Canada. Canada is not unique in arming Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a voracious appetite for Western arms. And in that context, Verity, other countries, certainly as mentioned, do arm Saudi Arabia. Some of the biggest players, the US, France, the UK, and some of these weapons have indisputably been used in Yemen, and have also found their way kind of to the broader region. However, many of these states remain kind of unrepentant in their arming of Saudi Arabia, and will continue to arm Saudi Arabia and minimize the risk, including other states parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. So in terms of the ATT, what are your thoughts on whether or not the ATT can make a concrete difference in this kind of business as usual attitude of many countries kind of contributing to the arms trade? Again, in particular, looking at other states parties to the ATT, how can or if the ATT can at all influence this attitude?
Thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, it can all sound quite doom and gloom when we talk about this, when we look at the actions of many of the big suppliers, but there are rays of light, and there is a kind of international context to this that I want to talk about. But we have seen at times, and this kind of goes back and forth, and the level of what they mean by cease or suspend is different in all of these countries, right? But Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland have all at some points during the conflict changed their position on whether they supply Saudi or not. And that some of them have cited the ATT as the reason why they're not going to anymore. And I think the other thing I really wanted to say about this, and it relates to my point about the Arms Trade Treaty being quite new, and although we have got to 110 states parties now, and the treaty is establishing itself, it has regular working groups, it is writing guidance for how it should implement the treaty, it is trying to look for best practice as that group. We have been encouraging states to call each other out for the most serious breaches. That is a very difficult thing for a state to do within that kind of treaty body where there's no formal, as Cesar said, accountability mechanism. But we have started to see it. You know, in the last few conferences of states parties that I've attended, there are 2 states in particular who have repeatedly said, none of us should be sending weapons into this conflict. And that is big in that space. And this is exactly the sort of thing that international norm building can do. But international norm building is the long game, right? The treaty was envisaged decades ago. Civil society Nobel laureates came together, worked with a small group of champion states. And I don't want us to forget either that there were a lot of states that worked really hard to create this treaty and to put this framework in place. And now our job is to see it being implemented in the most effective way. The other thing I did just want to mention that I didn't in my first part of the conversation was, you know, Amnesty has documented 6 different types of cluster munitions being used by the Saudi-led coalition. These weapons are indiscriminate. They are massively, you know, it's a pariah weapon to use. And yet this is the behavior of that end user. And so I know that it's not the main part of the treaty, but in this forward-looking risk assessment, we are supposed to look at an end user's adherence to and respect for the other international mechanisms of which the world is, you know, trying to put in place. And I think that for me, the use of cluster munitions in such a widespread way is irreprehensible and should, for any licensing officer, be one of the biggest red flags you could ever see.
Absolutely, and I mean, such a good point. If a country like Saudi Arabia is going to use cluster bombs, right? We know that their approach to conducting things like airstrikes is inherently indiscriminate, right? But many other countries, again, countries like France, the UK, the US, continue to export munitions, not necessarily always cluster munitions, but if you're going to export explosive material used in airstrikes to a country that already uses cluster munitions, how can you be certain that they're not going to use conventional bombs in ways that violate international humanitarian law, right? And this is all about that kind of forward-thinking prospective risk assessment. So I'm going to throw out one kind of general question, and then hopefully we have some time to get to Q&A. So this is for all three of our panelists. And once again, thank you everyone for all the questions in the chat. So, I mean, this deal really is a stain on Canada's kind of foreign policy, right? Arming a country like Saudi Arabia, this is something that really Canada needs to walk back from and do it soon. But if we have to kind of look maybe from a glass half full perspective, is there any silver lining to this? Does this teach us anything, maybe from a campaigning perspective or about the ATT? You know, even if this is such a bad deal, what can it teach us about arms control moving forward, and in the hope of stymieing the supply of weapons to serial human rights abusers?
I'll start perhaps to stick to the order that we were having with the questions, Kelsey. Silver lining to this. A couple of things I would say. I mean, one is awareness. I think public awareness, and these sort of relatively specialized arms control issues are a very tough sell for mainstreaming and for mainstream media and that sort of thing. Yet this issue, I think, has through the, you know, I think the weight of the questions that surround it has made it in Canada to the mainstream media to some extent. I think that awareness is very good. That public awareness, you know, that we have people, Joe or Jane, in the street, sort of, we're selling weapons in the billions of dollars to human rights violators, or even that cause and effect relationship between the seemingly innocuous manufacturing facility in southwestern Ontario and human rights violations, even if they happen halfway around the world. I think that awareness is good. We haven't given up on this from the Ploughshares perspective. I'm sure my colleagues feel similarly on this particular deal. Part of it has been implemented, but not fully. And we still think Canada should come to compliance as soon as today, so that can happen. But even if this one, you know, is fulfilled till the end, that I do hope that a similar deal would be harder, I think, to sell to the public, to go through the hoops, through the legal hoops here at Global Affairs Canada, etc. in the future, having this precedent, having this controversy, having having created these spaces such as this webinar right now to air the issues, you know, to, okay, what does Canada stand for? How seriously do we take our export controls, etc. And one last thing, not to prolong this too much, but I have to say, our area of focus relates to the norms, arms controls, domestic and international. But I always like to point out, Canada, beyond arms control, Canada has recourse to, Canada doesn't have to export to Saudi Arabia, even if the ATT clearance of the risk assessment does not obligate a country to export, you know, to somewhere. Canada has recourse to the Magnitsky Law, which is, you know, specifically tailored, for instance, to respond to the Jamal Khashoggi brutal assassination. Canada has the sovereign prerogative to not export to Saudi Arabia, whatever the arms control regime say. But we do have norms very clear that make it that the only defensible position for the Canadian government where it can claim to be in compliance with the law is to cancel these exports.
Yeah, I can feed on from Cesar's comments. Thanks for that. And yeah, I do think there are some bright spots or some silver linings that we can see here. And again, Verity and Cesar have been doing this longer than I have, but from my understanding, it's also important to think about where we've come from. And Verity mentioned a little bit about that around the history of the treaty, right? When weapons deals were all about the imperatives of, you know, the economic situation or about the defense interests of Canada. At least we've moved beyond that. At least we have a situation in which human rights, international humanitarian law are a direct part of the conversation. And I do think that that's something that resonates very strongly with, you know, with Canada in this case. Canadians look at this, and we've seen that through the media coverage, where I think that generally speaking, there is a sentiment that, if people know and people understand what the risks of these weapons being used to, to engage in acts of warfare, that they will stand up. And we see that the government actually has been sensitive to that as well, right? Maybe for the wrong reasons, but following the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, there was this rethink of, we're selling weapons to, to who? And this, this regime, which is responsible for this kind of activity. So I think that there's a result of public pressure there, and I will do a bit of a shameless plug for something that was mentioned in the chat there. We have 20,000 people who have signed Amnesty's petition on this and e-action, and the link is in the chat. If this is something that you would like to add your name to say, that this is something that you're against for the reasons hopefully that we've presented a few in this webinar, that's an action that you could be able to take to be part of that conversation of saying why this is something that we don't want to see Canada continuing a path that Canada would continue to go on. And just to reiterate the point around the political sensitivities and some of the political courage that's been shown, I go back to the point that Kelsey was making, where we did have the minister look back at those exports in the case of Turkey and say, that we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to cancel these export permits. So it can work. It has worked. We shouldn't lose sight of that. This is a big deal. There's a lot of economic implications at stake. But I do think that, speaking of looking at silver linings, I do think that we have to take the experiences of, for example, Turkey into account, of the decision at least to suspend in 2018 into account, and say, when there's enough public pressure around this, we can see the government making what we consider to be the right decision.
And I think the panelists have covered so much of it, and it'd be great to have another question, but I want to just talk about one other touch point that I think is maybe unique to the Canadian situation. The Arms Trade Treaty was quite innovative in that, as part of the risk assessment, it included Article 7.4, which is around gender-based violence, and that the risk of the arms proposed transfer being used to either commit or facilitate gender-based violence was one of the factors that had to be taken into account when you're doing your risk assessment. Canada's positioned itself on the international stage as an international gender champion. They fund projects, they speak on panels, they create documents that really position them as a government that wants to take that work forward. And when I think of armoured vehicles, one of the biggest threats, or even just transport vehicles, the biggest threats I see is that risk of facilitation of gender-based violence. I see people being taken from one place to another and to have those crimes committed. And I think, all of the black site work that we did a couple of years ago as Amnesty, vehicles were involved in that as well. And we saw torture and other ill treatment in those places. So those vehicles are part of that violation. And so I think you've done such an amazing job as Canadian civil society lately to elevate this issue and to get it into the public awareness. And if you keep doing that, the political landscape at the right moment with that pressure on the other side means that the change will come, because the law is there now in the ATT. And if implemented properly, this type of deal wouldn't be happening. So keep at it, I guess, is what I'm saying here.
And thank you for those words of encouragement, Verity. Sometimes we need them. But I'm going to just sprint right into our Q&A session. So we have lots of questions. I've collected some. I've collected a couple and kind of collated them. This is going to be a bit of a potpourri of questions, and we'll try to keep it short so we can get to them, because we are hoping to end at 2 p.m. promptly. So a first question asked is, so Canada, and I mean, this can go really to any country. So Canada arms, for instance, the US more than Saudi Arabia. And again, this could be any country, a country that supplies weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia might not be their sole export destination. In fact, that's almost never going to be the case. So if a country is arming other countries in Saudi Arabia that also pose risk of violating human rights with those weapons, or facilitating gender-based violence, or disrupting peace and security, I mean, how do we square that circle? Do we just focus on Saudi Arabia, that might be, if you had to put them on a scale, the worst human rights abuser, or do we open up the focus? What does that look like?
I could maybe jump in. From my perspective, at least, it's absolutely important to open up the focus. We have been working along with Ploughshares and others on this issue of the Saudi Arabia arms deal for the time being. But again, there are many other examples where, again, compliance with the Canadian law, with international law is absolutely crucial. We've talked about Turkey. One that we haven't talked about that recently has raised a lot of questions has been around the situation in Colombia, whether any of the arms exports to Colombia are contrary to Canada's obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty. Very important to keep, I think, a close eye on this situation as well. And I would say, just to note, it's also outside of just that question of export, and others will be able to fill in here, Kelsey or Cesar, around brokering as well. That's another big issue that's kind of come up a little bit more recently. You may have seen some reporting in the Globe and Mail on a particularly significant brokering arrangement that has attracted attention as well. So there's a lot of scope to expand this. This is a particularly lucrative deal. We haven't talked about, for example, the sniper rifles that Canada exports to Saudi Arabia. It's not just light armored vehicles. These are, we do export other kinds of weapons to Saudi Arabia as well. So a much more comprehensive, I think, look is really important. But the figures, and the value of those arms exports and the longstanding nature of those arms exports of light armored vehicles is certainly, I think, part of the reason why that's top of mind, but shouldn't be to the exclusion of anything else.
And
just
please go ahead, please.
Yeah, if I may, just to quickly add to that. I mean, one of the key premises in the arms trade, around arms free trade implementation is the notion of case by case, and there is various. But at the end of the day, because you need to conduct a proper, credible, objective, and reliable risk assessment every single time, assess the risk of misuse or abuse. Having said that, just in the past few years, we know for a fact there have been Canadian weapons in places like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey, Israel, Colombia, Libya, Iraq, and Syria. That is it's not a good list, of recipients for Canadian arms exports. So I think that the big question here is, and I noticed in the chat there was a question about what norms exist or how strong the norms are or something like that. And this is on paper, the norms are generally good. We would say on paper the norms are not that bad, both domestic and international. The key shortcoming is around effective implementation. We're not short of good norms. We're not short of aspirational statements. We're not short of lofty rhetoric around coming from Ottawa around increased rigor and transparency on the arms trade. We have all the rhetoric, even around gender and around being a gender champion. We have all the right rhetoric, but with the arms trade, it's about effective implementation and matching those words with effective action.
Great, Cesar. So I'm going to throw out two more. And again, answer them as you see fit. It's a potpourri of questions. So we have an interesting question, and this is something that those that work in arms control, but also those that kind of work in the peace space more generally, we get questions like this all the time. So this idea that, there might be rules, but if you're in the heat of combat, do you think someone is going to say, oh, Canada sold me this rifle and they're a states party to the ATT, so I can't use it in contravention of IHL? What does that look like, right? Or does Canada's kind of status as a states party to the ATT, does that have any material change in a combat scenario? And then another question that we get frequently, and we also hear potentially from Ottawa once in a while, is this idea of if we don't sell them the weapons, someone else will. There's many ways to address this. I think the first one is to say that there's already many like-minded states that have stopped supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, but I'll pose this to our panelists. And again, we'll try to keep this tight so we can close up at 2 or just afterwards on time.
Well, just because I had offered long silence, if I can offer something. On the latter, if we don't do it somewhere else, well, I think it's embarrassing to have that as a line of argument. There's this author. He used to have a column in the New York Times called "The Ethicist," Randy Cohen or Randy something, and he used to say on this very question, not in the context of the Saudi arms, of the Canadian Saudi arms trade, but in the context of somebody else always doing everything. And he said, he wrote something like, somebody else will do just about anything. I've met somebody else, and he's a little weasel. And of course, you know, it's a cop-out, it's an escape line of argumentation, and importantly, it is devoid of any ethical considerations. But furthermore, as Kelsey said, it is less and less true, because these somebody else's are having debates in their parliaments, they're canceling export permits, they're restricting their government's ability to ship exports to Saudi Arabia. So it's also just less accurate by the day.
Thanks. Just on that question, I think I found it in the chat about, you know, this was made by Canada, so I'm not allowed to use it on civilians. It wouldn't be at that point that the decision about where the arm came from would be taken, right? It's about the export licensing decision to the end user. So I think by the time a weapon is in someone's hand, the ship has sailed, and we wouldn't at that point be asking someone to change it. And yeah, we've heard a lot of, you know, if we don't sell it, someone else will. And in the UK, one of the big things we worked on for years was, what about the jobs, right? What's going to happen to the people in the industry? And that's a really live issue, especially when there are elections coming up and things like that also. And not an Amnesty position, but my friends from the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, which is an amazing organisation taking the UK government to court and doing all sorts of wonderful things. They talk about the skills of the people who currently build arms, their engineers, their production workers, their factory workers. There are many, many, many things they could be repurposed. Those things could be repurposed into doing that don't involve creating weapons that ultimately are going to be used to take another human's life. So I think you're going to come up against those sorts of arguments. You are coming up to election time. Do think about, you know, how you message that in society and how you make this like a really key issue for those that are trying to seek election to answer to you.
And that, I think, is an apt point to end on, as we are looking down the barrel of an election here in Canada. So I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists, to our friends at Amnesty, who we co-authored and co-published this report with. We could not ask for better friends. Thank you all to our attendees. I also want to thank my colleague Branka, who is doing all of the background AV work and is keeping the lights on. Any other questions or concerns, you can follow up to us. We're always happy to engage. And we continue to hopefully push the envelope on this file to see some change, not only in Ottawa, but around the world. So thank you so much. A video recording of this webinar will be posted soon, which you can find on our social media channels. So yes.